Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Florida State heading into 2025. It might be the hardest team to evaluate going into the fall than just about any team across the country. Like, not only do you have a brand new roster coming in, you see all the red and blue on this screen, but you got a brand new coaching staff as well. And as we, kind of leave the spring, we enter into the summer. This is when you start kind of having the conversation of what your preseason top 25 is going to look like. You start putting out your conference rankings and conference predictions. We got a few DMs over the last couple of days regarding the boys sleeping on Florida State going into 2025. Now, this might be true. I want to talk about, all right, if we are in fact sleeping on Florida State, what's going to need to happen for Florida State in 2025 to kind of surpass our expectations around this program going into 2025? I'll tell you this. I don't know if I would say I'm sleeping on Florida State as much as it's just a healthy dose of skepticism around this team going into 2025, which I have heard from a lot of Florida State fans. Y'all probably sitting in a very similar position. Now, what needs to happen for Florida State? What is the avenue for Florida State to surprising a lot of people in the 2025 year? That's the conversation I want to get into. Before we get into it, as always, the Florida State fans, I think though, what I want to hear the most from Florida State fans, and I'll say this is probably my favorite part about doing this is hearing from the diehard Florida State fans in terms of, hey, what are the preseason expectations? What are your expectations regarding this football team in 2025? Because I'll be quite frank with you, sitting here in early May, I don't even know where to put my expectations for this football team in. And I see what Vegas is saying they're expecting. I'm still not sure what to expect from this football team. So I would love to hear from you guys in the comment section. Appreciate y'all rocking with it. If you guys do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Without further ado, there are four talking points that I want to get into. And number one has nothing to do with what we see on the roster. To me, it starts with the coaching staff. Now, I think the coaching staff, and we've talked about this a lot, the coaching staff that Mike Norvell just hired, completely revamping what the coaching staff and what this program looks like, this is going to determine if Mike Norvell makes it in Tallahassee or not. I'm a big fan of it. Now, let's start on the defensive side of the football with Tony White. You look at Tony White, and we're going to get a little bit more into it as we talk the defense. This is a defensive coordinator that has shown us historically he has the ability to come in year one and completely revamp a defense. Now, on the offensive side of the football, what excites me the most about Gus Malzahn is largely considered one of the better offensive minds that you see in all of college football. Now, he's going into a situation at Florida State where he can just focus on running the offense. He's been a head coach for the last decade plus. He's been a guy that has called the offense at multiple stops, but hasn't really been able to just be an offensive coordinator. Like when you're a head coach at UCF or when you're a head coach at Auburn, you got a lot of other moving parts from a week-to-week basis other than just scheming up the offense and calling the plays. What I'm most excited for with Gus Malzahn is taking a step back from the head coaching duties, just dialing it into, hey, how can I create the most explosive and effective offense possible? There's some real juice here. On paper, Gus Malzahn, Herb Hand on the offensive line, Tony White coming in on defense, Coach Knighton coming in on the defensive line. This is a significantly better coaching staff than Florida State had last year. That's where it starts. If Florida State shocks a lot of people in 2025, to me, it starts with the coaching staff really being an elite unit for this program in 2025. Now, number two, probably the biggest storyline for Florida State. You can talk about Thomas Castellanos. You can talk about the pass catchers. To me, it starts with the offensive line. Like the Florida State fans learned this last year. Like if you have a miserable offensive line, it's not just bad. It was the worst that we saw at the Power 4 level last year. If you have an offensive line that is that bad, you can't do anything on offense. You can have the best quarterback in the country with the best pass catchers in the country, which Florida State did not have. But if they were to have that, it still wouldn't have mattered because this Florida State offensive line was about as bad as I've seen in the last 5 years. That's what the grades tell me. That's what the film told me in terms of what we saw in the 2024 year. It starts with this unit up front. They bring in pretty much a brand new crew of starting guys. Now, here's what stands out to me about Florida State's offensive line going into 2025. Is there a more experienced Power Four starting offensive line than Florida State? You are bringing in over 8,000 career snaps between the five guys that are going to be starting for Florida State in the 2025 season. And Gunnar Hansen was a 3-year starter in the SEC. Micah Pettis was a 3-year starter in the SEC. Luke Petitbon was an all-conference 2-year starter at Wake Forest in the ACC. This unit on paper should be significantly, and I mean significantly, better than what it was in the 2024 year. And then the second conversation is, can it all come together? That's probably the bigger question that I have for Florida State. Can it stay healthy and can it come together? Because one of the things you kind of play with fire with when you decide to bring in a brand new offensive line is how well does this unit kind of mesh? That's going to be kind of a wait and see situation. I think there's a little bit of confidence with what Herb Hand can do developing this offensive line and kind of putting the best unit out there in 2025. And then the second part is you got to stay healthy, because I think there are still some lingering question marks about how deep this unit is. Like if Florida State has a couple of injuries happen on the offensive line, does the play significantly drop off? I think the starting five for Florida State on the offensive line should be a pretty solid unit. What does it look like if you have to go to your sixth or seventh or eighth offensive lineman? That's probably the storyline you have for Florida State. And quite frankly, the most important storyline last year, Florida State, these are just mind-boggling stats. 2.6 yards per carry. That's 132nd in the country. 12% sack rate. That was 131st. That is bottom 5 in both pass protection and in the run game for Florida State in the 2024 year. This offense didn't stand a chance. Didn't matter what quarterback was playing. Didn't matter who the pass catchers were. They couldn't run the football. They couldn't protect the passer. Recipe for disaster. Can we, I think most importantly, get back to running the football in the 2025 year? It starts with the offensive line, which, again, personnel-wise, there are a lot of, this is probably worth noting, there are a lot of offensive lines that you look at across the country and say, I hope the offensive line is good, but then you're looking at the personnel and saying it's hard to see a reality where it's good. And you look at Florida State and say, I can see a reality where this unit stays healthy, comes together, and is a massively improved unit from what we saw in the 2024 year. If you get that, like, look, Thomas Castellanos ain't going to be a top 10 NFL draft pick. We've talked about that all spring, but he is a guy that fits what Gus Malzahn and Mike Norvell want to do. Other storyline, hitting on the new pass catchers. Look, the pass catchers were a problem too. It started with the offensive line. That ain't no secret. You got 4 names that are coming into this program that excite me. I think you start with the portal additions like Deuce Robinson. What does it look like if Florida State surprises a lot of people in 2025? That probably includes Deuce Robinson being a first-team All-ACC guy, which is certainly possible, given the athletic profile and the set of traits that Deuce Robinson has. It probably includes Squirrel White, probably not being a first-team All-ACC guy, but probably being like a third-teamer and a guy that's really consistent for Florida State and kind of does what Florida State brought him in to do. And it probably includes a guy like Javon Boggs being a freshman All-American. All of those things that we just said, I don't think are out of the realm of possibility. But if Florida State wants to surprise on the upside, you probably need to see some of those things happen. Going over to the defensive side of the football, to me, it starts and stops with Tony White. I think the personnel, he did a really good job, especially in the winter transfer portal, revamping this front seven. I think this front seven, from a personnel standpoint, probably doesn't have the upside that it had a couple of years ago with guys like Jared Verse and guys like Patrick Payton. But I will say this. It is a Florida State defense that the personnel fits what Tony White wants to do with his defensive front, that front seven. We've seen this from Tony White. Tony White came to Nebraska in 2023, had that Nebraska defense as a top 20 defense in the country with only one NFL draft pick on that defense. I think Florida State is probably a more talented defense aggregately than what you go back and look at Nebraska having in the 2023 year. So can Tony White do, and I think the most important part of this is Tony White didn't need 2-3 years to do this. You see a lot of defensive coordinators need 2-3 years of runway to really get the defense rolling. Tony White didn't need that at Nebraska. Can you see that 1-year turnaround for Tony White in this new defensive coaching staff? Really important to monitor. And I will say this, Tony White bringing a lot of his staffers over from Nebraska. So you have a lot of continuity on the coaching staff. You maybe don't have a ton of continuity on the roster, but all of these coaches are kind of lockstep, have been together. You feel good about the coaching staff kind of getting the best out of these football players in terms of what Tony White wants to do. Are we sleeping on Florida State? I personally do not think so, because I think it's – let's just be realistic here. This might have a little bit to do with me buying stock in Florida State last year and not wanting to get burned again. There are reasons to believe in Florida State. Now, are all of these things going to come true? It's kind of to be determined. But if they do, look, this Florida State team is going to be more dangerous than people realize. No question mark about it. And I think if you're a Florida State fan, you just want to see a step in the right direction and then take another step in 2026. We're not looking for this 1-year fix where you maybe jump up to 9-3 and then you go back down to 5-7. Consistent, steady improvement, building this roster, building this program the right way. Something we didn't see from Mike Norvell early in his tenure, and that kind of resulted in the 2024 year we saw. That'll do it. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to y'all later.